but it's about John. First of all, he's a long-standing member of the Socialist Workers Party, first in Britain. I think he joined around the late 60s, John, or something, was it? Something like that, Jonas, yeah. And that now is living in Ireland and is a leading member of the Socialist Workers Party here. He's written many books. I remember myself being very influenced by his book on Marxism and the Party, which is a very good book to read and a very influential book, and makes a difference to how you organise things. And also just recently he's done a book called The Point Is to Change It, which is a short little book about Marx, which is really useful for us. And I'd just like to say one more thing, because I remember this. Tony Cliff, who was a leading member of the British SWP, used to say that John Molyneux was one of the best writers of making things, he's going to be embarrassed by this, making things, complicated things, simple. And certainly this book is very much like that. It is written as if he's speaking it, so don't feel you have to know a lot about anything to start reading this book. And as I said, it is available for €10. So John, with no further ado, please, John Molyneux.
Thank you. Right. I just want to emphasise the good bargain. 10 euros for a thickish book is a real bargain these days, I assure you. So I was down in Connolly Books, there, slim volumes for 20 quid. That's a commercial angle. Right. Richard spoke about the dominant narrative that exists if you're in a university or a college or in the media and so on about Lenin and the Russian Revolution. I'll come back to that. There's a lot about that in the book, and I'll say something about it today. But before that, I want to say that even more dominant than the dominant narrative at the moment is silence. Silence in Ireland, silence in Britain, silence in my partner Mary and I were in St. Petersburg. You know, the land, the city of the revolution, in the land of the revolution, in the 100th anniversary, and the silence was deafening. It was extraordinary to compare it with Ireland in 2016, you know, the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising. Now, we didn't like the way Enda Kenny handled it or the way the Irish state handled it. Of course we didn't, and so on. But it was acknowledged in Russia. Nothing, and generally speaking, there's been nothing. Whether that will change just as we get to October, I don't know. But at the moment, there's very little about it. And therefore, I want to begin by saying a few things about the Russian Revolution, and trying to bring home, especially to the younger people here, and to people who maybe don't know the history, what an extraordinary event this was, and how important it was, and how amazing it was. And in so doing, count both the silence and a bit of the dominant narrative to which I'll return. Let's start with what Tsarist Russia was. Tsarist Russia was an autocracy, a dictatorship, as we would say today, where the regime had been in place for nearly 500 years. Over 300 years of that under the Romanov dynasty, one dynasty, for 300 years. It had developed into the third largest empire in world history. The largest empire in world history was the British Empire, by some distance. I'm talking about land area, you know, because of India and Australia and Canada and so on. The second largest ever in history was the Mongol Empire in the 14th century, and the third largest in history was the Tsarist Empire, 4.5 times the size of the Roman Empire. And it ruled over innumerable different oppressed nationalities, places that now, you know, are independent states like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Georgia, the Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland, sorry. It dominated and oppressed all these countries, known as the prison house of the peoples. And this regime was legendary throughout Europe as the bastion of the established order, of everything that was most reactionary. They had defeated Napoleon back in 1814, 1815. Right, and since then they had defended the old order right everywhere in the regime was based on the oppression and exploitation of the serfs, the peasants, 100 million of them by the time we get to the 20th century. This had been going on for the best part of 1,000 years. The serfs had achieved nominal independence in 1861. You know, they were no longer actually, literally in serfdom, but they had remained an utterly impoverished peasantry, with the land monopolised by a tiny class of what we today would call super rich landlords. And this regime, the absolute bastion of international reaction for centuries, is overthrown in 1917, in February 1917, 5 days of workers' revolt. In 5 days of strikes and street fighting, Tsarism is brought to its knees, and the Tsar is forced to abdicate. He's forced to abdicate because the ruling class of Russia thought we'll sacrifice the Tsar to save our skins. So powerful was the revolt from below. Just imagine what a message that sent to the world. What an extraordinary achievement that was. And then you ask yourself, how did it happen? Why did it happen? The story gets even more inspiring. Russia, like all the world, almost all the major countries of the world, was at this point involved in the most horrendous and destructive war. A war that eventually claimed 16 million lives. Right across Europe, was turned into a charnel house. Right across Europe, ordinary working class people were being sacrificed for the war aims of their imperial rulers. Right, and they were being sacrificed in their millions. The reason the Russian Revolution of February succeeded in overthrowing the Tsar is because the soldiers, sailors of Russia, side with the people. They side with the workers on strike and demonstrating in the streets. And the Tsar had nobody left to defend him. Amazing occurrence. And then when you go through the rest of the 9 months later, by the time you get to October, you actually have ordinary people, not just overthrowing a reactionary emperor, but also overthrowing capitalism, also taking into their own hands the running of society through new form of workers' democracy, workers' councils, or Soviets, as they were called. Soviet just being the Russian word for council. This happens within 9 months. And the peasants who have been oppressed for 1,000 years rise up and seize the land. Right? They don't wait for someone to give it to them. They rise up and take the land and redistribute the land. And when that second revolution takes place in October, what it does in no time at all is really amazing. Right. Within days, they announced that Russia is coming out of the war. They're against the war, they don't want to fight the war, they propose peace to all countries on the basis of no annexations and so on. We're not having anything more of this imperialist war. Within days, the new government announces that all the land will belong to the people who work it. To the decree on them within days. The factories will be placed under workers' control within days. It's funny when you think of the way the Irish government behaves, or any government. You want anything? It takes about 3 years to get anything, doesn't it? Even a simple thing, you have to have a commission, a this, a report, a that, go through the door and so on, and maybe we can have a vote on it in 2 years' time. They did these things in days when they were working class. By December, this is not a time when nothing was going on. This is a time when the counter-revolution was mobilised and German imperialism was attacking and God knows what was going on. By December 1917, right, that is within about a month and a half, right, homosexuality was legalised in Russia. Something that didn't happen until 1967 in England, and when was it in Ireland? 1993. 1993 in Ireland. I'm sorry, it was legalised. In Russia, women won the right to choose, or abortion, so on, within note. All these things were happening at an extraordinary rate. So this event was a beacon to the whole world, to the peoples of the whole world, and to workers of the whole world. Again, just how inspiring this was, I think, comes over particularly in this book that I was looking at. It's called To See the Dawn, right? And it is about a conference organised by the Russian revolutionaries, by the Bolsheviks and so on, Lenin's government, that was held in Baku, Azerbaijan today, in 1920, a Congress of the Peoples of the East. Right, and it's an extraordinary, well, the pictures alone are extraordinary. It shows the delegates coming. Delegates came from around the world. A man called Harry Quelch, who was a British communist, came to this conference to denounce British imperialism. John Reed, American writer and journalist who was here in Russia, he went to represent the American workers to Baku. So that's interesting in itself. But more interesting is that the Muslim women, you see, organised at it, proposing motions about the liberation of the women of the East, some wearing a hijab or some in traditional dress, some not. The ordinary people, many of the ordinary people who you see in the pictures of in this, look like they come from the Middle Ages, yet they're attending this conference by the peoples of the East. How inspiring was this event. So I think that's worth saying, right, as I say, for today, that this was this extraordinary event, in many respects the greatest revolution in world history. Now, when I go back to the dominant narrative is that Leninism led straight to Stalinism was the same thing, yes. And key to that also is the idea that the revolution of October 1917 was somehow a behind-the-scenes coup organised by Lenin and a few other political leaders. But it was not really a workers' uprising. It was just a little sort of seizure of power by a well-organised band of professional revolutionaries. And that the American government actually has invested considerable amounts of money and time in the cultivation of this view of the Russian Revolution. They employed lots of ex-Russian socialists and Mensheviks, gave them professorships, gave them funds and so on, and developed a whole narrative of this. But actually, right, it still doesn't withstand the slightest contact with the facts. Again, I want to make it very concrete. Right? One of the things you can see when you're in St. Petersburg is the battleship, the Aurora. It is still there as a kind of museum on the Neva, the main river through Petersburg. This battleship, what did this battleship do in the revolution? In October, this battleship was commandeered by its sailors, who sailed it across the Neva, the main river, lined it up outside the Winter Palace, and said, we're going to blow you to kingdom come unless you transfer all power to the Soviets, to the workers' councils. Now, I would like to translate this to Ireland and the Liffey and the Irish Navy, but that's a bit silly, doesn't it? Imagine that you had a battleship that was taken over and sails up the Thames, parks outside the Houses of Parliament and Buckingham Palace, and says, we're going to bombard you unless you hand over power to the workers. Now, maybe that was all arranged by Lenin and a small band of conspirators, but I think actually the sailors had something to do with that. You know, what did Lenin... How come, by the way, they didn't get shot by their officers for mutiny? Because they'd already mutinied. They'd already driven out the officers. All these things had happened already. And then you have the revolution in November the 7th, October the 25th was changing the calendar. The actual day, the seizure of power, well, all over in a day and so on. There weren't millions of people on the streets. Why weren't there millions of people on the streets? Why weren't there loads of soldiers on the streets who were doing what happened in Catalonia? I'll come back to that in a second. You know, battening them off the streets, shooting them. No, because actually the entire working class and almost the entire army and navy had come over to the side of the revolution. And so they were able to march to the Winter Palace, arrest the government and transfer power to the Soviets in the space of 24 hours. the fact that it all went so smoothly was not because it was some secret behind-the-scenes coup, which would have led to real bloodshed and fighting, but because the entire working class had been united. It's actually testament to the complete opposite to what it's supposed to be. Now, so we come back then to the question of Lenin and his role in this. Now, Trotsky, in his great History of the Russian Revolution, says that he thinks without Lenin, this revolution would not have succeeded. Now that sounds, on first hand, that contradicts what I've been saying, doesn't it? It sounds like, well, one minute you're saying it's all the workers, themselves emancipating themselves and so on, but now you're saying without Lenin it wouldn't have happened. Actually, it's not a contradiction. Let me explain that. What Trotsky believed was that without Lenin, the political leaders of the working class, first of all, people like the Mensheviks and the SRs and so on, the established parties, but also probably a lot of the leaders of the Bolshevik party would not have had the nerve to take power, or they would have aborted the revolution. And it was the influence of Lenin that was able to overcome their resistance, their either lack of nerve, or their own political perspective, or their conservatism, or whatever it was. And that the intervention, the role of Lenin was crucial in that. But the role of Lenin was crucial, I think Trotsky was right, the role of Lenin was crucial, not in opposition to the workers, but because Lenin, more than any other revolutionary at the time, or any other time, I think, had an organic relationship with the workers and represented and fought for not just the interests of the workers, but the perspective of the workers. I have to say that I don't think I've read a fair bit now of Marx, of Engels, of Lenin, of Trotsky, of Rosa Luxemburg, Gramsci, all the classical Marxists. But there is no one, none of them, they're all on the side of the workers, of course, they all understand the role of the working class and so on, but there is none who compares to Lenin in terms of their organic relationship with the actual workers and how the workers are feeling. That is right in his bones from Herman. It's extraordinary, and he always writes from that point of view. And what happened in 1917, he arrives from exile at the Finland station. He comes back in April, and he says, we must aim for workers' power. It's no compromise with this provisional government that we've got, or we're keeping capitalism and so on. We must aim for workers' power. And everybody, all the other leaders, including many of the leaders of the Bolshevik Party, went, this guy's gone mad. This is crazy. What's he talking about? This was including people like Zinoviev, Kamyev, Stalin, other leaders of the Bolshevik Party. Yet within a few weeks, Lenin has won. They have a conference, and Lenin has won the conference. Why? Because what Lenin was saying echoed and expressed what the workers were saying in the who are flooding into the Bolshevik Party. He was saying what the workers of the Vyborg district, the factory district in St. Petersburg, which you can still just see bits of as it happens, what they wanted. And so there was a dovetail, him arguing at the top, and then their pressure coming from them. And you see this again and again in 1917. When it comes to September, October, and Lenin coming to the conclusion that we can actually have an insurrection and establish Soviet power, workers' power, again there's resistance among the high-ups in the Bolshevik Party and so on. And Lenin says to these people, he says, I'm going to argue this. If you don't do anything, I'm going to resign and go to the sailors and the rank and file because they're with me. And that's how he wins the argument, and that's how it unfolds. It's Lenin's organic relationship to the working class that explains his decisive role in the revolution itself. Right, now, the book is primary purpose, the clue is in the title, is about the relevance of Lenin for today. I've spoken a bit about the history and what actually happened. I want to speak now a little bit about why I think he's so important for today. And when it says Lenin for today, of course, it means, our times. this year, the next 5 years and so on. But I thought today I'd be literal about it. Today, what happened today? What happened today, literally, is there was a general strike in Catalonia. Right? And I think I've been, talking to other socialists, and I look like other people, what goes on Facebook. I saw some posts about it today from people who certainly consider themselves socialists, and other people who are puzzled about this phenomenon of Catalan nationalism, and what should we say about it, and not sure, well, should we be on their side or shouldn't we, and where should we stand, and what about this nationalism thing, it's a bit dodgy, isn't it, and all that sort of thing. If you wanted to understand where socialists should stand on the question of self-determination of Catalan people, you have to know a bit about what's going on in Catalan, but theoretically you want to understand it, the right place to start is with Lenin. And Lenin wrote extensively on this question. He wrote extensively on this question because it was a crucial question in Russia, because of all those different nations that were oppressed by the Russian Empire. They had to get it sorted, but he also understood it was a crucial question internationally and in Europe and so on, the analysis of it. He understood, actually, extraordinarily, the importance of it in relation to Ireland. This is an obscure debate now, but it always struck me. Rosa Luxemburg, who's, there's some really great revolutionary socialist internationally, but she did not support the right of nations to self-determination, and she didn't get Irish struggle at all. And at some point, they would debate this thing, and at some point she said, you're calling for the independence of Georgia or something. Might as well call for the independence of Ireland. It's silly. And Lenin proceeds to give Rosa Luxemburg a lecture, as you could read, on A, the history of Ireland, and B, the history of what Marx and Engels had written about Ireland, and so it goes on for pages. Lenin turns out to know all about the history of Ireland and the struggle for Irish freedom, and then when in 1916 the Rising happens, he writes brilliantly on how this rising will fit into and be part of the struggle against imperialism in general and the bourgeoisie and so on. It makes wonderful reading. And he wanted to know why we should start by defending the right of the Catalans to self-determination. No ifs, no buts. It's nothing to do with being nationalist or soft on nationalist. It's to do with being internationalist. If you're going to be internationalist, you have to defend the right of people to self-determination. And if you don't, you end up apologising for dominant power nationalism. In this case, the nationalism of the Spanish state and so on. So you defend people's right to self-determination from an internationalist point of view, and you see the radical dynamic of that. So Lenin is a most brilliant starting point for understanding the event of today, in the most literal sense. He's also not bad when it comes to understanding the events of Sunday. A big section of the book is devoted to Lenin's theory of the state and revolution. This was Lenin's most important, greatest book, which he wrote in the middle of the revolution in 1917. Broke off writing the book because he said, actually, I'm sorry, I've got to actually do a revolution, and that's better than writing about it. Most of the book was written in August, September 1917. He had to break it off for the October Revolution. And this book has been the subject of all sorts of debate and argument. And my book goes through a lot of the academic arguments and it goes through the arguments about bourgeois democracy against Lenin's idea of overthrowing and smashing the state and workers' power and so on. It goes through all the defence of the existing arrangements. It goes through also a lot of the arguments put by reformist socialists and by Euro-communists. I don't know if anybody here has attempted to read a man called Nikos Palatzis. He has a lot of influence in Greece, had a lot of influence on Syriza, and so on. Extremely complicated arguments about what the nature of the state is and so on, as a condensation of class relations that you can work in and through and so on. In contrast, this all sounds very much cleverer than Lenin, who says when push comes to shove, what is the state? The state is armed bodies of men. Except what happened on Sunday. Did the struggle pass through the labyrinthine courses of the state and working out and setting this sector against that and so on? Or did a bunch of armed men with clubs come and beat people off the streets? Actually, when struggle intensifies, when there is a real conflict of interest, what Lenin says about the state turns out to be spot on. It doesn't mean you don't deal with all the complexity, but he's dead right, and he's dead right on the fundamental question that he argues in State and Revolution, that we, and the working class, cannot take over the existing state apparatus. He's not, he's not sort of mad ultra-left who says you should never stand in Parliament or you shouldn't vote in elections and all those sorts of things. No, he's in favour of doing all those things, in favour of contesting the terrain, but understands that we cannot use, in the final analysis, we can't use their Dáil, their Senate, their police, their armed forces, their whatever ministries to run society in the interests of working people. We have to create a different workers' democracy. And I think that the history of the 100 years on since Lenin wrote those ones has proved him right hundreds of times, and I think it's absolutely correct today. Now, another part of the book deals with the question of Lenin's theory of imperialism and how relevant that is, but Richard has said the most important things that need to be said, and so I won't repeat that. I'll just say one very short point on this, which is that Lenin's model of imperialism was of a number, not a huge number, but 6 or 7 great powers struggling against one another for the division and redivision of the world. Because a lot of people thought Russia was socialist and so couldn't be imperialist, and then because when Russia collapsed they thought there was only America left standing and so on, lots of people on the left abandoned that idea and thought that imperialism, the clash of interests between rival imperialist powers, had gone away. They thought states were no longer important. It was just people called Hart and Negri thought it was all just economic corporations and so on, and states and wars were a thing of the past. There are all sorts of ideas like that around. You look at the world, Richard made the point, you look at the world today and it's clear that fundamentally Lenin was right on this question and remains right today. The last point I want to talk about is absolutely central to Lenin, which is the question of the role of the party. Richard referred to it, I just want to say a bit more about it. The question of the role of a revolutionary party, building a revolutionary party. The idea that Leninism is this nasty way of organising and so on is part of the dominant narrative, and Lenin is demonised for this a lot. In particular, a book that he wrote in 1901 called What is to be Done? This master plan for world domination is kind of the way it's described. But people haven't read it, I think. Maybe they read it and still think that, but I think they haven't read it. One of the remarkable things about this book is that, you know, all the debates that go on about oppression and identity politics and so on, and where socialists should stand on the question of the oppression of women, the oppression of gay people, the question of religion, and all of those kinds of things that we're all Lenin dealt with all of this in principle in this book, What is to be Done. Right? And he was very, very clear. He said it is the duty of a socialist, and you're not a socialist if you don't do this, to fight all forms of oppression and stand up for all the oppressed. Right? He gave particularly examples of religious minorities. Right? Lenin was a pretty staunch and fierce atheist, but he gave the example of defending religious minorities in Russia. Right? And again, how relevant that is today. It's very interesting. I spoke about the Congress of the East. Another example of the influence of the Russian Revolution was in the same year that happened, 1920, there was a debate in Germany there was a big party in Germany called the Independent Social Democrats. They had split from the main Social Democratic Party, but they had hundreds of thousands of workers, and they were moving leftwards. And Zinoviev, representing the Russian Revolution, debated with Martov, who was a Menshevik, in front of this Congress. They debated for about 4 hours. Zinoviev spoke for about 4 hours or something like that. But at the end of the Independent Social Democrats have voted to affiliate to the Communist International. Well, I think that revolutionary socialism recruited about 300,000 or 400,000 workers that day. It was extraordinary. But it's very interesting if you read the debate. Because what does Martov say about the Bolsheviks? You're supporting the Muslims, is one of his main arguments. What's the matter with you? Why are you supporting the Muslims and the mullahs and so on? It's strange how these arguments that come up today on Facebook when you say defend Ibrahim Halawa were going on then in 1920, and so it's just interesting in terms of relevance and of Lenin. So Lenin said, first of all, the Socialists and the Socialist Party, the Revolutionary Party, has to defend all the oppressed. Second thing he says, it has to exist, it has to be independent of the reformist leaders. Right? He was not in favour of the Revolutionary Party just merging itself with the, like the Labour Party or the Labour leaders or the Social Democrats. So he didn't say you never fight alongside them, but you didn't merge with them. And the third point, he said, most important, was that you exist independently, but you actually have to relate to workers' struggles as they are going on in their communities. The issues they're fighting over, in the workplace, in their community, and so on. Whether it's water charges, or it's repeal the 8th, or it's, and so on. He didn't, of course, say water charges or repeal the 8th, but what he said was social insurance, or the right to workers' rights in the workplace, or the right to vote, and so on. You had to fight on all the day-to-day issues, and he was emphatic on the importance of that. And again, yes, shut up, says Marnie, which is quite right. But I just think that all of that, and so much more, turns out, when you actually read it, to be such a good guide to socialist practice today. So, as you can probably tell, I'm passionate about the Russian Revolution, and I'm quite passionate about Lenin, because I think he's such a great revolutionary, and we have so much to learn from him.